Welcome back to our channel. In today's video, we'll explore the story of a woman who was a giant in her own right, both literally and figuratively. A woman of boundless energy, ferocious intelligence, and a booming, infectious laugh that could fill the grandest of halls. But for most of her life, she was known by a title that both defined and confined her. She was Jacqueline Kennedy's right-hand woman. Her name was Letitia Tish Baldrige, and her life was a fascinating, complex, and often poignant journey through the heart of American power. This is the story of the woman who built the glamour of Camelot, only to find herself gently but firmly shut out of the very fairy tale she helped to write. To truly understand Letitia Baldrige, you have to understand the world that forged her, a world of stark contradictions. She was born in 1926 into an America still gilded with the trappings of the Roaring Twenties, but soon to be humbled by the Great Depression. Her world was one of privilege and expectation. Her father, H. Malcolm Baldrige, was a Republican congressman from Nebraska, a man who embodied the sturdy, no-nonsense values of the Midwest. Her mother was a society woman, ensuring her children were raised with the Polish and connections of the East Coast elite. Tish was a product of both worlds, the heartland's pragmatism and the Eastern Seaboard's sophistication. This was an era when a woman's path was a clearly drawn and narrowly fenced map. For a woman of her class, the destination was almost always the same. A prestigious women's college followed by a suitable marriage to a man of equal or greater standing. A career was often seen as a temporary diversion, something to do before real life, a husband and children, began. The concept of a woman building a lifelong, independent professional identity was not just uncommon, it was faintly radical. But from her earliest days, Tish was built on a different scale. She was not delicate, demure, or destined to blend in. For one, there was her astonishing height. By the time she was a young woman, she stood a commanding 6 feet 1 inch. In an age of petite femininity, she was a skyscraper, a presence that could not be ignored. And her personality matched her stature. She was blessed with a powerful, resonant voice, a quick, analytical mind, and what friends would describe as a locomotive of energy. She was born to manage, to organize, to lead. Her path naturally led her to the hallowed, ivy-covered halls of Vassar College, the crucible for the nation's most promising young women. It was there, in the autumnal quiet of upstate New York, that her life would intersect with destiny. One of her fellow students was a young woman who was in many ways her polar opposite. Her name was Jacqueline Bouvier. Where Tish was loud, direct, and pragmatic, Jackie was quiet, artistic, and ethereal. She spoke in a famously breathy whisper and was more interested in poetry and art history than in running for class president. Yet a friendship bloomed. Perhaps it was a case of opposites attracting, or perhaps they recognized in each other a shared intelligence and a desire to carve out a life more interesting than the one society had prescribed for them. They became close, sharing secrets and dreams in their dormitory rooms. After graduation, they cemented their bond with a trip to Europe. Two bright young women exploring a continent still healing from war, standing on the precipice of a future neither could possibly predict. Soon after, their lives would diverge onto seemingly different tracks. Jackie became an inquiring camera girl for a Washington newspaper, a society beauty who would soon captivate a rising political star from Massachusetts. Tish, meanwhile, had no intention of settling down. She was setting her sights on the world. While the American press was beginning to chronicle the fairy tale romance of Jackie Bouvier and Senator John F. Kennedy, Tish Baldrige was quietly and methodically building one of the most impressive careers of any woman of her generation. She rejected the conventional path of marriage and instead embraced a life of professional adventure in the high-stakes, male-dominated world of international diplomacy. Her first major posting was at the American Embassy in Paris. This was not a token position. Working under Ambassador David Bruce in the early 1950s, she was plunged into the complex world of post-war European politics. France was grappling with the loss of its colonial empire and navigating its new place in a world dominated by two superpowers. Tish's role as a social secretary was diplomacy in action. She learned to use soft power before the term was even coined, creating environments where difficult negotiations could take place and where American culture could be showcased as a powerful asset. She organized events, managed a massive diplomatic residence, and learned to navigate the labyrinthine protocols of French high society with an efficiency that impressed her seasoned and mostly male colleagues. Her success in Paris led to an even more challenging assignment. She was appointed the social secretary to the formidable Claire Booth Luce, the U.S. ambassador to Italy. Luce was a true powerhouse, a celebrated playwright, a former congresswoman, and a brilliant, demanding, and often intimidating intellectual. Working for her in Rome was, as Tish would later admit, the ultimate trial by fire. The American embassy in Rome was a hotbed of Cold War intrigue, and Luce was a fierce anti-communist. The social events Tish managed were not mere parties. They were carefully calibrated political instruments. She was responsible for the Villa Taverna, the ambassador's magnificent residence, and its constant stream of cardinals, movie stars, politicians, and spies. Under Luce's exacting mentorship, Tish honed her skills to a razor's edge. She learned how to manage a massive staff, how to anticipate a crisis before it happened, and how to stand her ground with powerful men who were unaccustomed to taking orders from a young woman. Ambassador Luce famously described Tish as a steam engine in pants, a backhanded compliment that perfectly captured her relentless drive and astonishing competence. By the end of the 1950s, Tish Baldrige was a seasoned diplomatic professional, a woman who had proven her mettle on the world stage, entirely on her own terms. Her reputation for excellence had spread beyond government circles. In 1960, she was headhunted for a groundbreaking position at the legendary jewelry company Tiffany & Company in New York. They offered her a job as their first ever female executive, a director of public relations. It was a testament to her abilities, a prestigious and lucrative role that would secure her financial independence and place her at the pinnacle of the corporate world. She accepted the job, ready for a new chapter, and then one fateful day, the telephone on her brand new executive desk rang. The voice on the other end was the soft, familiar whisper of her old college friend, Jackie Kennedy. Her husband had just won the presidency of the United States. The soon-to-be First Lady, just 31 years old and facing the monumental task of becoming the hostess for the nation, sounded overwhelmed. She made a simple, direct plea. "Tish, will you come and help me?" It was a pivotal moment. Tish stood at a crossroads. On one side was the secure, well-paid, and prestigious corporate life she had just begun. On the other was a return to government service, for less pay, longer hours, and under the most intense public scrutiny imaginable. It was a choice between her own burgeoning career and service to her friend and her country. For a woman like Tish, there was really no choice at all. She resigned from Tiffany's, packed her bags for Washington, and prepared to step onto the world's biggest stage. The curtain was about to rise on Camelot. When Letitia Baldrige walked through the doors of the White House in January 1961, she brought with her a worldly sophistication and a modern managerial mind. What she found was an institution steeped in tradition, but socially dormant. The Eisenhower years had been dignified and formal, but the White House felt, to Tish's dynamic sensibilities, like a stuffy and provincial hotel. The menus were bland, the entertainment was predictable, and the guest lists were heavy on aging politicians. It was respectable, but it was not inspiring. Jackie Kennedy had a vision to change all that, but a vision without execution is just a dream. Tish was hired to be the executor, the operator, the logistical genius. They created a role for her that had never existed before. She was named both White House Social Secretary, in charge of all entertaining, and Chief of Staff to the First Lady, in charge of her correspondence, her schedule, and her public image. It was a tacit acknowledgement of the immense power the role of First Lady was about to assume, and a testament to Tish's unique ability to handle it all. What followed was not just a redecoration of the White House, but a complete cultural rebranding of the American presidency. Tish and Jackie worked in symbiotic partnership. Jackie, with her impeccable taste and deep knowledge of history and the arts, was the guiding spirit. Tish, with her boundless energy and diplomatic expertise, was the engine that made the vision a reality. She was, in every sense of the word, the architect of Camelot's public face. Her daily routine was a relentless marathon of controlled chaos. She was the first to arrive in the East Wing and the last to leave, often working late into the night, perfecting seating charts or answering urgent cables. The public's fascination with the new First Lady was immediate and overwhelming. Tish's office was buried under an avalanche of mail, sometimes as many as 10,000 letters a week. She had to build an entire system from scratch to manage the flow, ensuring every letter was read and that personal, thoughtful replies were sent. She was the ultimate gatekeeper, the person who decided who got access to the First Lady, who shielded her from the endless demands of the press, and who fiercely protected her image. But her most visible and revolutionary work was in the art of White House entertaining. State dinners were transformed from stiff formalities into dazzling cultural showcases. Tish brought in the celebrated French chef René Verdon, who immediately banished the overcooked roast beef and instituted a new era of sophisticated cuisine. But the real revolution was on the guest lists. Tish and Jackie made a deliberate and strategic decision to celebrate American intellectual and artistic achievement. They believed the White House should be a stage for the nation's best and brightest, a symbol of excellence that would project a new image of America to a world locked in a Cold War. Suddenly, the White House guest lists were sparkling with names that had never been there before: writers, poets, artists, scientists, and musicians. One of the most legendary evenings was a concert by the famed cellist Pablo Casals. The 84-year-old virtuoso had long refused to perform in countries that recognized Franco's regime in Spain, but he made an exception for the Kennedys. Tish managed every intricate detail of the historic event, which was broadcast on television and heralded around the globe as a triumph of American culture. Even more ambitious was the dinner she organized in April 1962 for 49 Nobel Prize winners from the Western Hemisphere. It was an unprecedented gathering of intellectual firepower. Tish worked for months on the logistics, arranging travel, navigating the complex egos of geniuses, and creating an evening that was both intellectually stimulating and socially elegant. It was at this dinner that President Kennedy made his famous toast, saying it was the most extraordinary collection of talent that has ever been gathered together at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. That line became legendary, but the evening itself was pure Tish Baldrige, a masterpiece of cultural diplomacy. Beyond the glamour, Tish was a key operational figure in Jackie's most passionate and enduring project, the historical restoration of the White House. The First Lady was appalled to discover that the mansion's historic furnishings had been sold off or replaced with reproductions. She envisioned restoring the White House to its original grandeur, turning it into a living museum of American history. While Jackie was the project's public champion and artistic director, Tish was a vital force behind the scenes. She helped manage the newly created Fine Arts Committee, liaised with wealthy donors, and handled the complex logistics of acquiring, cataloging, and placing priceless antiques. It was a massive, museum-level undertaking, and Tish's managerial skills were indispensable to its success. To be so close to the center of power was exhilarating, but it was also a life of constant problem-solving, of averting disasters the public never knew were happening. Tish was the ultimate fixer. There's a story she would tell years later that perfectly encapsulates her role. The President of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, was coming for a critically important state visit. Days before his arrival, Tish was reviewing the elaborate preparations at a government guest house and noticed something was missing. Nehru was a widower who traveled with his daughter Indira Gandhi, who acted as his hostess. Tish, with her impeccable attention to detail, realized there was no proper dressing table in the daughter's suite, an oversight that could be perceived as a slight. She immediately took charge. She didn't delegate. She got in a car and personally went to the finest furniture store in Washington. The store was closed. Undeterred, Tish found the owner's home number, called him, and persuaded him to open his store on a Sunday. She selected the perfect dressing table, arranged for its immediate delivery, and ensured it was in place, as if it had always been there, long before the Indian delegation arrived. No one in the press or the public ever knew. It was a tiny detail in a massive diplomatic dance, but it was everything. That was Tish Baldrige, the invisible hand ensuring the magic of Camelot appeared seamless and effortless. This proximity gave her a unique window into the private lives of the first family. She was more than an employee. She was a trusted confidant. She saw President Kennedy, the powerful leader of the free world, sneak away from the Oval Office to play with his children, Caroline and John Jr., on the White House lawn. She saw Jackie's profound struggle with the crushing weight of public life, her fierce, almost primal instinct to shield her children from the constant glare of the cameras. Tish became a co-conspirator in this effort, helping the First Lady arrange private moments away from the press and often taking the heat from reporters frustrated by the lack of access. Her loyalty was absolute, but even in the midst of this intense, all-consuming work, the fundamental differences in their personalities were clear. Jackie craved privacy with the desperation of someone who had none. Tish, while protective of her friend, was a natural extrovert who understood and even enjoyed the public arena. She knew how to work with the press, how to give them just enough to keep them satisfied. There were times she found Jackie's total retreat from the public frustrating, even if she understood the reasons for it. It was a small fracture line in the foundation of their friendship, a hint that their needs and their natures, which had aligned so perfectly for this moment in time, might not be compatible forever. The world tilted on its axis on November 22, 1963. The dream of Camelot was not meant to fade away. It was meant to be shattered in a single violent instant. Tish had recently transitioned from her White House role to a position at a Kennedy family-owned business in Chicago, the Merchandise Mart. She was in a meeting when a secretary burst in, her face ashen, with the news from Dallas. Her first and only thought was of Jackie. She immediately dropped everything and flew back to Washington. What she found was a city paralyzed by grief and a White House transformed into a house of mourning. She went straight to Jackie's side. In the horrific, surreal days that followed, Tish was a rock of competence and compassion in a sea of chaos. While the world watched the grieving widow's incredible display of public courage, Tish was behind the scenes, helping to manage the unmanageable. She helped coordinate the funeral arrangements, greet the endless stream of world leaders who came to pay their respects, and simply be a comforting presence for her devastated friend. One of her most significant and heartbreaking tasks was to help the new widow deal with the global outpouring of sympathy. Letters began pouring into the White House by the thousands, then tens of thousands. Eventually, over 800,000 condolence letters arrived. It was a testament to the world's love for the fallen president, but it was an overwhelming logistical and emotional burden. Tish, the master organizer, set up a system and worked with a team of volunteers to ensure that every single letter was acknowledged. It was a monumental act of grace in the face of unspeakable tragedy. She stayed on for several months, helping Jackie pack up her life in the White House and transition to a new, private existence in Georgetown. The bond between them, forged in college and tempered in the crucible of the White House, seemed stronger and more unbreakable than ever. Tish would forever be one of the keepers of the Kennedy flame, a loyal member of the court in exile, or so it seemed. In the years that followed Dallas, Jacqueline Kennedy embarked on a new and difficult journey, the search for a life after Camelot. She moved to New York City, and Tish, who also lived and worked there, remained a part of her trusted inner circle. They were a living link to a past that was both a source of immense pride and unbearable pain. But the woman who had been America's queen was changing. The weight of being the nation's widow was a heavy crown to wear. She grew increasingly fearful for her children's safety, especially after the assassination of her brother-in-law, Robert F. Kennedy, in 1968. She became obsessed with privacy, building impenetrable walls around herself and her family. The final decisive severing of her past came in October 1968, with a decision that shocked and confused a public that still saw her as their own. She married Aristotle Onassis, a Greek shipping magnate, a man who was unimaginably wealthy, powerful, and utterly removed from the world of American politics. For many of the Kennedy loyalists, the marriage felt like a betrayal of the legacy. For Jackie, it was a desperate act of self-preservation. Onassis could offer her something no one else could: a private island, a fleet of security guards, a fortress against the world she believed had taken everything from her. With that marriage, she made a deliberate and ruthless break. Her new life as Jacqueline Onassis was to be a fiercely private one. This meant cutting ties with the people and places that reminded the world and perhaps herself of who she used to be. There was no single dramatic confrontation with Tish Baldrige. There was no formal letter of dismissal. Tish hadn't officially worked for her in years. Instead, there was a gradual, then total cessation of contact, a chilling silence. The phone calls stopped. The invitations to dinner ceased. It was, for all intents and purposes, a quiet excommunication from the life of the person to whom she had dedicated so much of her own. For Tish, it was a profound and painful loss. She had built her public identity around her service to the Kennedys. She had been the ultimate insider. Now she was on the outside looking in. The public and the press never stopped asking her about Jackie. For decades, Tish would handle these questions with her characteristic diplomacy and class, always speaking of her former friend with respect. But the hurt was undeniable. Years later, in a moment of rare candor during an interview, she tried to explain it. She had to have a new life. We all understood that, Tish said, her voice tinged with a sad resignation. She explained that Jackie wanted no one in her life who might speak to the press, and Tish, by virtue of her career in public relations, was a public figure. The two worlds, once so intertwined, were now fundamentally incompatible. The friendship that had defined the most vibrant chapter of her life had effectively been terminated. For the rest of her long and productive life, Tish Baldrige would live with this strange duality. She was a successful, powerful woman, but in every introduction, every newspaper profile, the first clause was always the same. Letitia Baldrige, former social secretary to Jacqueline Kennedy. The shadow of Camelot was inescapable. It was both the foundation of her fame and the cage that confined her public persona. The world was endlessly fascinated by her White House stories, and the stories they always wanted to hear were about Jackie. She was forever cast in a supporting role, the keeper of a memory from a kingdom whose gates were now closed to her. But Letitia Baldrige was not a woman designed to wither in anyone's shadow. She was a survivor, a pragmatist, and a brilliant businesswoman. If the world was going to forever associate her with the Kennedy White House, then she would turn that association into a new kind of currency. Instead of being consumed by her past, she masterfully leveraged it. She took the experience, the reputation, and the unparalleled expertise she had gained at the pinnacle of power and used them to build an entirely new empire, one that was unequivocally her own. In 1964, she founded her own public relations and marketing firm, Letitia Baldrige Enterprises. She became a sought-after consultant for America's largest corporations. She went into boardrooms filled with men and taught them the very same principles of grace, diplomacy, and strategic communication that she had used to charm heads of state. She understood that the skills used to run the White House were directly transferable to running a successful business. But her greatest triumph, her most enduring legacy, would come through the written word. She began writing books, more than 20 of them, not gossipy tell-alls about the Kennedys, but practical guides to modern living. She took on the subject of etiquette, a field that had become dusty, old-fashioned, and associated with the rigid rules of high society. Tish single-handedly reinvented it for the modern world. Her comprehensive updates to the Amy Vanderbilt Complete Book of Etiquette made it the definitive guide for generations of Americans. Tish's genius was in understanding that the world had fundamentally changed. Women were pouring into the workforce, needing to navigate office politics and business lunches. International travel was becoming commonplace. The old rules no longer fit the new realities. So Tish wrote new ones. She wrote about how to conduct a business meeting with authority and grace. She offered the first real guidance on the etiquette of new technologies, like the fax machine, and later email. She gave practical advice on how to be a good boss, how to handle difficult colleagues, and how to entertain at home without a staff of servants. She taught a nation that etiquette was not about snobbery or which fork to use. It's a barrier of defense against the slings and arrows of the outrageous, she once said. It's a code of behavior that has to do with consideration for others. For Tish, good manners were simply a form of ethical conduct, a way of moving through the world with respect, kindness, and efficiency. She became America's official Grande Dame of Etiquette. With her commanding presence and no-nonsense delivery, she was a frequent and beloved guest on television talk shows and a highly paid lecturer. She had finally and completely stepped out of Jackie's shadow and into a spotlight of her own making. She had taken the Kennedy brand of class and sophistication and transformed it into the Baldrige brand, a mark of practical elegance, competence, and modern civility. It was a remarkable second act, a powerful testament to her resilience, her intelligence, and her uncanny ability to adapt and thrive. The life of Letitia Baldrige is a sweeping story of achievement set against the backdrop of the 20th century. But beneath the surface of the history-making events, it is a deeply human story about the intricate and often fragile nature of friendship, the complexities of loyalty, and the lifelong struggle to define one's own identity. For a few shining, incandescent years, she stood at the very epicenter of American power and glamour, the indispensable woman behind one of the most revered figures of modern times. She was a primary architect of a national myth, a vision of American elegance and intelligence that still holds a powerful grip on our collective imagination. She taught generations of Americans that civility and success were not mutually exclusive, that good manners were a form of strength, and that navigating life with consideration for others was the ultimate mark of sophistication. She carved out her own unique and respected place in American culture, becoming a household name entirely on her own terms. Letitia Baldrige passed away in 2012 at the age of 86, having lived a life of extraordinary purpose. Yet the quiet, unresolved story of her relationship with Jacqueline Kennedy offers us one final, poignant lesson. It is a powerful reminder that even the most chronicled and glamorous lives are filled with private pains, unspoken sorrows, and relationships that fracture under the immense pressures of history. It speaks to the difficult truth that paths diverge, and the people who once stood at the very center of our world can become distant, cherished, and sometimes sorrowful memories. Letitia Baldrige spent a lifetime navigating the delicate balance between a public past she could never escape and a future she was determined to command. She was the woman who stood faithfully beside a queen, but in the end, she forged her own very impressive reign. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.